Have you ever wondered what happens when the only witness to a crime is a child who can't speak? What I'm about to tell you will forever change your view of justice. A traumatized 5-year-old boy, a criminal with a perfect defense, and a service dog with an extraordinary memory. In a silent courtroom, the almost imperceptible movement of Lucas's fingers triggered a reaction no one expected, except Thor, his four-legged protector. This true story goes from silence to a whispered "thank you" that moved an entire nation. Subscribe now and comment where you're watching from. This story of connection, courage, and loyalty awaits you. The mahogany doors of the Cook County Courthouse in Chicago swung open as 5-year-old Lucas Mendez entered, his small hand gripping tightly to the specialized handle of his service dog's harness. Thor, a Belgian Malinois with alert amber eyes and a distinctive scar running along his left flank, walked in perfect rhythm beside the boy. The dog's muscular frame and attentive posture made it clear he was more than just a pet. He was Lucas's guardian, confidant, and bridge to a world that had become frightening and incomprehensible. Judge Richard Morrison watched from his bench as the child made his way down the center aisle. 27 years on the bench had exposed him to countless cases, but few had affected him like this one. A child witness, the only witness, who hadn't spoken a single word since the attempted abduction 6 weeks ago. The boy's dark curls fell slightly over his eyes, which remained fixed on the polished floor tiles as he walked. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Richard Morrison," the bailiff announced, his voice echoing through the tense courtroom. Lucas's mother, Elena Mendez, a pediatric nurse with exhaustion etched into the lines around her eyes, whispered to her son, "It's okay, mi amor. Thor is right here with you." She gently squeezed his shoulder as Assistant District Attorney Sarah Jenkins approached them. "Mrs. Mendez," Jenkins said quietly, her navy suit immaculate, case files clutched to her chest. "Lucas looks very brave today. The court has approved all our requests. He'll testify from a separate room via closed circuit, and Thor can stay with him the entire time." Elena nodded, lines of worry creasing her forehead. "But without him speaking, what can he really tell you?" Jenkins's expression remained professional but compassionate. "Sometimes, Mrs. Mendez, silence speaks volumes. And today, Thor might help Lucas communicate in ways we haven't anticipated." From his elevated position, Judge Morrison studied the scene below. At 63, with silver hair and deep-set eyes that missed little, he had built his reputation on being thorough and fair. This case troubled him deeply. No physical evidence, no confession, and a traumatized child who couldn't or wouldn't speak. The decision before him could either put away a dangerous predator or potentially condemn an innocent man. "Your Honor," defense attorney William Barrett stood, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the courtroom. "I must once again object to the presence of the dog. This is highly irregular and prejudicial to my client." Judge Morrison leaned forward, removing his reading glasses. "Mr. Barrett, we've addressed this in chambers. The court has ruled that given the child's condition, the service animal serves a legitimate therapeutic purpose. Your objection is noted but overruled." As Lucas was led to the witness preparation room, Thor remained vigilant beside him. The dog's training was evident in his focused demeanor, but those who worked with service animals might notice something else, an unusual intensity when the animal's gaze swept across the defendant's table. "This is a difficult day for everyone." Judge Morrison addressed the court, his tone measured but firm. "But I remind everyone present that our purpose here is justice, not just for those who can speak for themselves, but especially for those who cannot." Court is now in session in the case of the state versus Daniel Carson. Outside the courtroom windows, Chicago's winter sent swirling snow against the glass, creating an isolating backdrop for the drama unfolding within. A silent boy, a protective dog, and a judge determined to uncover the truth, no matter how deeply it might be buried. Daniel Carson sat at the defense table with an air of calculated composure. At 46, the software engineer's appearance was meticulously crafted, his charcoal gray suit tailored to his trim physique, his salt and pepper hair neatly styled, and his titanium-framed glasses giving him an intellectual, almost professorial look. To the casual observer, he appeared nothing like the monster the prosecution was trying to paint him as. "Mr. Carson," his attorney William Barrett whispered, leaning in close, "remember what we discussed. Keep your expression neutral. The jury is watching your every reaction, especially when the boy enters. Daniel nodded almost imperceptibly. I have nothing to hide, Will. They have no case, just a traumatized kid who can't even speak and a dog. His voice carried the confident tone of a man accustomed to solving complex problems methodically. Barrett arranged his documents, his Harvard law degree having prepared him for cases far more challenging than this one. The prosecution has no physical evidence linking you to the attempted abduction. No DNA, no fingerprints, no surveillance footage. They're desperate. From the prosecution table, Assistant District Attorney Sarah Jenkins reviewed her notes one final time. Her case was built on circumstantial evidence. Daniel Carson's vehicle spotted within 2 blocks of the attempted abduction. His unexplained absence from work during the time window. A similar attempted abduction in the same neighborhood 3 years earlier that had gone cold. All compelling, none conclusive. Judge Morrison cleared his throat. The prosecution may call its first witness. The state calls Lucas Mendez to the stand, Jenkins announced. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as a court officer escorted Lucas and Thor to the witness stand, modified specially for this testimony. A child-sized chair had been placed beside the regular witness seat, and a small water bowl for Thor sat discreetly in the corner. Objection, Barrett rose immediately. Your Honor, the prosecution is clearly attempting to evoke emotional responses from the jury by having this theatrical display. Judge Morrison's eyes narrowed. Mr. Barrett, we've already ruled on the accommodations for this witness. Objection overruled. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, observing the small boy being sworn in, or rather, the court making accommodations for a witness who couldn't verbally swear to tell the truth. A slight smile played at the corner of his mouth. This is ridiculous, he muttered to Barrett. How can they seriously expect to convict me based on whatever this kid doesn't say? Barrett shot him a warning glance. Not now, Daniel. Jenkins approached Lucas gently. Hi, Lucas. I know this is hard, but you're doing great. I'm just going to ask you some simple questions, okay? The boy stared at his hands. Thor sitting protectively at his feet. Lucas, do you remember the day at Brighton Park when someone tried to take you? Jenkins asked, her voice soft but clear. Lucas remained silent, his small fingers now gripping the edge of his chair. From the gallery, Elena Mendez watched, tears welling in her eyes. Her husband Marco, a construction foreman who had taken time off work for the trial, placed his arm around her shoulders. What a waste of the court's time, Daniel whispered, his confidence growing with each moment of the child's silence. The prosecution's case continued with testimony from the park attendant who had heard Lucas's screams and witnessed a man fleeing from the scene, though she couldn't make a positive identification. Next came the trauma specialist who had been working with Lucas since the incident. In your professional opinion, Dr. Winters, Jenkins asked, why hasn't Lucas spoken since the event? Dr. Winters, a gray-haired woman with kind eyes behind practical glasses, explained. Lucas is experiencing selective mutism triggered by severe trauma. The brain's response to overwhelming fear can manifest this way, particularly in children. But his silence doesn't mean he doesn't remember. In fact, traumatic memories are often encoded more deeply than ordinary ones. During cross-examination, Barrett was relentless. So, Dr. Winters, you're asking this court to consider nonverbal cues from a 5-year-old as evidence in a criminal case where my client's freedom is at stake? Isn't it possible that this child's imagination, combined with the power of suggestion from well-meaning adults, has created a narrative that never actually happened? Daniel nodded slightly, pleased with his attorney's strategy. His perfect defense was working. Discredit the trauma, emphasize the lack of evidence, present himself as the wrongfully accused victim of circumstance. With each passing hour in the courtroom, his freedom seemed increasingly secure. The afternoon session began as a shaft of winter sunlight briefly pierced through the courthouse windows, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air above the witness stand. Lucas sat small and still, Thor positioned protectively at his feet, his amber eyes scanning the courtroom with an alertness that seemed almost human. Assistant District Attorney Jenkins approached carefully, aware that traditional questioning methods were useless with a child who wouldn't, or couldn't, speak. Lucas, she said gently, I know you can't tell us with your words, but is there any way you could show us if you see the person who tried to take you that day at the park? Defense Attorney Barrett was on his feet instantly. Objection. Leading the witness, Your Honor. Counsel is practically inviting the child to point at my client. Judge Morrison considered this. Sustained. Ms. Jenkins, please rephrase. Jenkins nodded respectfully. Lucas, do you remember what we practiced with Dr. Winters? You don't have to speak or point. You can use the special signals you learned in therapy. From the defense table, Daniel Carson maintained his composed demeanor, but a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes betrayed his first moment of genuine concern. He whispered to Barrett, What signals? You didn't mention anything about signals. Barrett frowned. This is the first I'm hearing of it too. The courtroom fell silent as all eyes focused on the small boy. Lucas's gaze remained downcast, his fingers fidgeting slightly with the hem of his blue button-down shirt. For almost 30 seconds, nothing happened. Just as Judge Morrison was about to intervene, Lucas's right hand moved. The motion was subtle, 3 fingers briefly extended, then curled back in, followed by a small circular motion with his index finger. To most observers, it might have appeared as nothing more than a child's random fidgeting. But Thor's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The Belgian Malinois' posture shifted from alert to rigid. His ears flattened slightly against his head, and a low, rumbling growl emanated from deep in his chest, not aggressive enough to alarm the court officers, but clear enough to draw everyone's attention. Most startling was the dog's gaze, which had locked directly onto Daniel Carson with an intensity that seemed to transcend animal instinct. Your Honor, Barrett objected again, rising quickly. This is outrageous. They're using a dog to essentially testify against my client. Judge Morrison raised his hand for silence, his eyes narrowing as he observed the scene unfolding before him. The dog's reaction was unlike anything he'd witnessed in his years on the bench. Mr. Barrett, no one has claimed the dog is testifying. I'm simply observing the interaction between the witness and his service animal. Daniel Carson's composure fractured momentarily. A bead of sweat formed at his temple despite the courtroom's cool temperature. This is absurd, he hissed to Barrett. They're turning this into a circus. From her seat in the gallery, Elena Mendez gasped softly, recognizing the hand signal, one that Dr. Winters had helped Lucas develop during therapy sessions, a silent way to communicate, I see the bad man, without having to speak or point. Judge Morrison studied the scene carefully, his judicial instincts honed by decades on the bench telling him something significant had just occurred. The connection between the boy's subtle hand movement and the dog's immediate reaction to Carson seemed too precise to be coincidental. Court will take a 15-minute recess, Judge Morrison announced abruptly, tapping his gavel. Counselors, please approach the bench before you leave. As the gallery began to clear, Detective Garrett Novak, a 20-year veteran of the Chicago PD's Special Victims Unit who had been observing from the back of the courtroom, made note of what he'd just witnessed. His weathered face remained impassive, but his mind was racing with new possibilities. In the hallway outside, reporters huddled together, speculating about the unusual recess. Something happened in there, Chicago Tribune reporter Melissa Chun said to her colleagues. Did you see the way that dog reacted? And the judge's face. Back inside the emptying courtroom, Thor remained vigilant, his eyes never leaving Daniel Carson even as Lucas was escorted out by a court officer. The dog's protective instinct seemed to have transformed into something more, recognition. And in the complex ecosystem of the American justice system, this unexpected moment had shifted the delicate balance of the case in ways no one could have anticipated. Detective Garrett Novak lingered in the courthouse corridor, his attention fixed on Lucas and Thor as they waited with Elena Mendez on a bench away from the crowd. 23 years with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit before joining the Chicago PD had taught him to notice what others missed, and right now, everything about the dog's behavior was setting off alarm bells in his mind. Mind if I join you? Novak asked Elena, showing his badge. His voice carried the slight raspiness of a former smoker, and the lines around his gray eyes spoke of countless cases that had left their mark. Elena nodded cautiously. You're the detective from the original investigation. Novak crouched down to Lucas's eye level, maintaining a respectful distance. Hey buddy, he said softly. Thor's doing a great job in there. He observed how the boy's hand rested protectively on the dog's back, fingers gently twined in his fur. Has Thor always been this responsive to Lucas's signals? Novak asked casually, though his question was anything but. Elena brushed a strand of hair from her face. They've only been together for 4 weeks. The therapy program fast-tracked Thor's placement because of Lucas's condition after what happened. Novak's eyes narrowed slightly. 4 weeks isn't much time to develop that level of communication. He watched Thor, who remained alert but calm next to Lucas. Where did Thor come from? He was a police K-9 before becoming a service dog, Elena explained. He was injured during some operation and couldn't continue police work. The therapy program said he had the perfect temperament for trauma support. Something clicked in Novak's mind. He pulled out his phone and quickly scrolled through old case files. Was Thor with the Cook County K-9 unit? Yes, I think so. What? Novak didn't answer immediately, his weathered face thoughtful as he studied the dog's distinctive scar. Mrs. Mendez, would you excuse me for a moment? He stepped away and made a quick call. Sanchez, it's Novak. I need you to pull all the K-9 deployment records from the last 3 years. Focus on a Belgian Malinois named Thor, injured in the line of duty. Cross-reference with any cases involving Daniel Carson, even peripherally. He listened for a moment. Yeah, I know it sounds crazy. Just do it. I'll owe you one. Meanwhile, in Judge Morrison's chambers, a heated discussion was underway. Your Honor, what we just witnessed was nothing short of theatrical manipulation, Barrett argued. A dog growling means nothing in terms of evidentiary value. Judge Morrison removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Mr. Barrett, I'm not making any rulings based on the dog's behavior. But I also can't ignore what appears to be a meaningful communication from a traumatized witness who cannot speak. ADA Jenkins stood her ground. The defense wants to exclude any evidence that doesn't fit their narrative. Lucas's therapist prepared him to communicate in nonverbal ways, and that's exactly what he did. By using a trained animal to prejudice the jury? Barrett countered. Enough, Judge Morrison said firmly. Ms. Jenkins, what exactly was that hand signal? Dr. Winters developed it with Lucas during therapy. It means I recognize the person who tried to take me. It's one of several signals they've established. Back in the corridor, Novak's phone rang. He stepped away from the Mendez family to answer it. Are you sure? He asked, his expression growing increasingly focused. Send everything to my tablet now. He ended the call and turned toward the courtroom, his mind piecing together a theory that seemed implausible yet increasingly compelling. Thor had been deployed in an operation 18 months ago, an unsuccessful surveillance of a suspected child trafficking ring. During the operation, Thor had encountered a suspect who had wounded him before escaping. The suspect was never identified, and the case went cold. But Thor's reaction in the courtroom wasn't just the protective instinct of a service dog. It was recognition. When court resumed, Novak slipped back into his seat at the rear of the courtroom, watching Carson with new eyes. The perfect defense might have just developed its first crack. Detective, a young officer approached, handing him a tablet. The records you requested. Novak scrolled through the files, his expression hardening as he found what he was looking for. A partial fingerprint from the trafficking case that hadn't matched any suspects at the time. It wasn't enough for an arrest then, but now. Get this to the lab, he whispered urgently. Tell them to compare it to Carson's prints from this case. Priority 1. As Judge Morrison called the court back to order, Novak caught ADA Jenkins's eye and gave a subtle nod. Something significant had just changed in the case against Daniel Carson, a connection that no one could have anticipated, least of all Carson himself. The courtroom hummed with tension as ADA Sarah Jenkins approached the bench, her posture betraying a newfound confidence that hadn't been present that morning. During the recess, Detective Novak had briefed her on his suspicions, and now she held a sealed evidence envelope in her hand. Your Honor, the prosecution requests permission to introduce new evidence that has just come to our attention, Jenkins said, her voice steady and deliberate. Defense Attorney Barrett immediately rose to his feet. Objection. The prosecution can't introduce surprise evidence mid-trial. This is completely improper. Judge Morrison looked between the two attorneys, his expression stern. Ms. Jenkins, you know the rules of discovery. Why am I hearing about new evidence now? Your Honor, this evidence was only uncovered during the recess, Jenkins explained. Detective Novak made a connection based on what transpired in court today that led to the discovery of forensic evidence directly relevant to this case. The judge beckoned both attorneys forward. Approach the bench. As they huddled before him, Jenkins opened the envelope and quietly explained the contents while Barrett's face grew increasingly pale. "This is outrageous," Barrett hissed. "You can't possibly expect to introduce this now." Judge Morrison studied the documents with a practiced eye. "I'm inclined to allow it, Mr. Barrett. The prosecution couldn't have reasonably discovered this connection earlier." Barrett's voice rose slightly. "Then I request time to prepare a response to this new theory." After a moment's consideration, Judge Morrison nodded. "Court will adjourn until tomorrow morning to give the defense time to review this evidence. Ms. Jenkins, provide Mr. Barrett with everything immediately." As the judge's gavel fell, Daniel Carson leaned forward anxiously. "What's happening, Will? What evidence?" Barrett gathered his papers, his usual confidence visibly shaken. "They're claiming they found soil samples from your car that match a remote location, some cabin in the Kettle Moraine forest. They're getting a search warrant as we speak." Carson's face remained composed, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. "That's absurd. I've never been to any cabin. They also have a partial fingerprint from an old trafficking case they want to compare to yours," Barrett continued quietly. "Something about the dog recognizing you from a previous encounter. It's thin, but the judge is allowing it." In the gallery, Elena Mendez watched the exchange between Carson and his attorney, sensing the shift in the courtroom atmosphere. Detective Novak approached her, his expression guarded but hopeful. "Mrs. Mendez, we may need Thor's assistance tomorrow," he said. "Would that be possible?" She nodded, stroking her son's hair as Lucas leaned against her, exhausted from the day's events. "Whatever helps." As the courtroom cleared, ADA Jenkins gathered her team in a small conference room. "We have exactly 18 hours before court reconvenes," she said, spreading a map across the table. "The cabin is here, about 2 hours northeast of the city. Local authorities are securing a perimeter, but they're waiting for our forensics team." Detective Novak studied the map, his mind already running through tactical approaches. "I want to bring Thor," he said. "If Carson was there, Thor might pick up on it. Service dogs retain their training." "Is that even allowed?" a young assistant prosecutor asked. Jenkins nodded. "The Mendez family has agreed. Let's move quickly." By dusk, a convoy of unmarked vehicles traveled north on Interstate 94, headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. In the lead SUV, Detective Novak sat with forensic technician Amelia Rodriguez, one of the department's most meticulous crime scene analysts. The soil samples from Carson's wheel wells contained a specific mixture of clay and mineral content only found in this region, Rodriguez explained, showing Novak the analysis on her tablet. Combined with the cellular data showing his phone pinging off towers near this area 3 different times in the past month. "It's still circumstantial," Novak said, "but it's more than we had this morning." As night fell completely, the convoy turned onto increasingly remote roads. The cabin's location had been discovered through painstaking analysis of land records, a property purchased through a shell company that, with enough digging, connected back to an IP address Carson had used. "This guy covers his tracks," Rodriguez observed. "He's careful." Novak's weathered face remained impassive. "Not careful enough." The cabin finally came into view, an unremarkable structure nestled among tall pines, its windows dark. As law enforcement personnel established positions around the perimeter, Novak felt a familiar tension, the moment before a case either breaks open or hits another dead end. "No signs of recent activity," reported a tactical officer. "But someone's definitely been here in the past week." Fresh tire tracks beneath the newer snow. With search warrant in hand, Novak gave the signal to proceed. As officers secured the seemingly empty cabin, he followed with Thor, who had been temporarily restored to his Police K-9 status for this operation. The dog moved with purpose, nose working, his training overriding his newer role as a therapy animal. The cabin's interior revealed little at first glance: sparse furnishings, a kitchenette, nothing immediately incriminating. But Thor's behavior changed as he entered the main room, becoming increasingly alert. "He's onto something," Novak said quietly. The dog moved deliberately toward a large area rug, pawing at its edge. When officers pulled it back, they discovered what appeared to be a trapdoor built seamlessly into the wooden floor. "Get me a crowbar," Novak ordered, his pulse quickening. As the trapdoor swung open, stale air rushed upward from the darkness below. Flashlight beams revealed a crude wooden staircase descending into what appeared to be a reinforced cellar. Chicago PD. Novak called down. Is anyone there? The silence that followed was broken only by a faint, muffled sound, almost like crying. The beam of Detective Novak's tactical flashlight cut through the darkness of the cellar, illuminating concrete walls and a dirt floor. The air was heavy with dampness and something worse, the unmistakable odor of human confinement. Thor moved forward with determined purpose, his training overriding any hesitation. FBI. Chicago PD. Novak called again, his voice echoing as he descended the wooden stairs, weapon drawn. Two tactical officers followed closely behind, their movements precise and coordinated. The basement was larger than it first appeared, with a main area that branched off into two smaller rooms. The first contained nothing but a metal folding chair and a tripod. The second room was secured with a padlock. Get bolt cutters, Novak ordered, his voice tight. The muffled sounds were coming from behind the locked door. As an officer ran to retrieve the tool, Thor whined anxiously, scratching at the door. His behavior confirmed what Novak already suspected. Someone was inside. We're here to help, Novak called through the door. You're safe now. We're police officers. The bolt cutters arrived, and with a single powerful squeeze, the padlock fell away. Novak took a deep breath before slowly pushing the door open, Thor at his side. What he saw stopped him cold. A child, a boy no older than 8, was huddled in the corner of the tiny room. His wrists were bound with zip ties secured to a metal ring embedded in the wall, allowing limited movement. A thin mattress lay on the floor beside a plastic bucket and a small stack of children's books. A battery-powered lantern provided the room's only light. The boy looked up, his eyes wide with fear and disbelief. His face was dirty, his clothes too large for his thin frame. When he saw Thor, something like recognition flickered across his features. Dog, he whispered, the word barely audible. Novak holstered his weapon and crouched down, maintaining a non-threatening distance. Hey buddy, he said softly. My name's Garrett. I'm a police detective. This is Thor. We're going to get you out of here, okay? The child stared at them, trembling but no longer crying. Am I going home now? The simple question hit Novak like a physical blow. Yes, he promised. You're going home. As a female officer specialized in child trauma approached to help, Novak stepped back, speaking urgently into his radio. I need an ambulance at the location. We have a recovered child, appears to be male, approximately 7 to 8 years old. He paused, controlling his emotion. And get me everything we have on missing children in the tri-state area from the past year. Forensic technician Rodriguez was already documenting the scene, her camera capturing every detail of the makeshift prison. Detective, she called, pointing to a small surveillance camera mounted in the corner of the room. This is live. There's an SD card too. Novak's expression darkened. Bag it, and check for remote access. Carson could be monitoring this right now. As the boy was carefully freed from his restraints, a medical technician wrapped him in a thermal blanket. His name is Rafael Antunes, the technician said after checking a medical alert bracelet on the child's wrist. Reported missing from Milwaukee 6 months ago. Thor stayed close to Rafael, seeming to recognize him. The dog's unusual behavior suddenly made more sense. If Carson had brought Thor here during his previous life as a police K-9, the dog might have encountered Rafael. Outside, Agent Lorraine Shin from the FBI's Child Exploitation and Human Trafficking Task Force arrived, immediately taking charge of coordinating with Milwaukee authorities and Rafael's family. We need to move carefully here, she advised Novak. Carson's attorney will claim you had no probable cause to connect this scene to his client. Novak shook his head. The soil evidence got us the warrant. What we found here will get us a conviction. And there's more. Thor's reaction to Carson wasn't random. He recognized him from a previous operation, and now we know why. As Rafael was guided toward the waiting ambulance, Thor walked protectively beside him. The boy reached down tentatively to touch the dog's head. He came here before, Rafael said suddenly, his voice stronger. The dog. With police. But the bad man ran away. Agent Shin exchanged a significant look with Novak. We'll need a full statement, but not tonight. He needs medical attention and rest. Novak nodded, watching as the forensics team continued processing the scene. The meticulousness of Carson's planning was becoming apparent. The remote location, the shell company ownership, the surveillance system. This wasn't opportunistic. It was calculated. Bag everything, he instructed the team. Every fiber, every fingerprint. I want this place taken apart down to the studs. As dawn broke over the forest, casting long shadows through the trees, the full investigative machine of federal and local law enforcement descended on the cabin. What had begun as a case about an attempted abduction had transformed into something far more sinister. In Chicago, as Carson slept in his expensive downtown condo, unaware of the developments at the cabin, Judge Morrison received an urgent call that would change the direction of his case entirely. Tomorrow's court session would no longer be about reasonable doubt. It would be about connecting a predator to his victims. The Cook County Courthouse buzzed with activity the following morning. News of the FBI raid and the recovery of Rafael Antunes had spread through law enforcement channels, though a media blackout kept the details from the public. Security had been doubled, and the usual spectators had been joined by representatives from the Department of Justice and the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit. Judge Morrison entered the courtroom with a grave expression, the weight of the case's new dimensions evident in his bearing. "All rise," the bailiff announced. As the gallery settled, Daniel Carson was led in by court officers. His confident demeanor from the previous day had vanished, replaced by a tense alertness. He leaned toward Barrett, whispering urgently, "What the hell is happening? My condo was searched at 5 a.m. They took my computers, my phone, everything." Barrett's usually polished appearance showed signs of strain. "They found something, Daniel. I don't know the details yet, but it's bad. The prosecution has filed amended charges." Carson's face paled slightly. "What are you talking about? Amended charges for what?" "All parties are present, Your Honor," the court clerk announced. Judge Morrison addressed the court. "Before we proceed, I want to remind everyone that the gravity of this case has increased substantially overnight. I expect complete professionalism from all parties." He turned to the prosecution table. "Ms. Jenkins, I understand you wish to amend the charges against the defendant?" ADA Jenkins stood, her demeanor composed but intensely focused. "Yes, Your Honor. In light of new evidence discovered last night, the state is amending the original charge of attempted kidnapping to include additional charges. Kidnapping in the first degree, false imprisonment, child endangerment, and possession of child exploitation material." Murmurs erupted in the courtroom. Carson gripped the edge of the defense table, his knuckles white. "This is outrageous." Barrett objected, rising to his feet. "Your Honor, the defense has had no opportunity to review this alleged new evidence. We demand immediate disclosure and time to prepare a response." Judge Morrison nodded. "Ms. Jenkins, are you prepared to share the new evidence with defense counsel?" "Yes, Your Honor. We have compiled everything discovered during the execution of the search warrant." She gestured to several large evidence boxes being wheeled in by court officers. "Additionally, the state requests permission to add a new witness to our list, Rafael Antunes." At this, Carson visibly flinched, drawing a sharp look from Detective Novak, who sat in the front row behind the prosecution table. "Your Honor," Barrett protested, "this is trial by ambush. How can my client possibly receive a fair hearing when the prosecution introduces an entirely new witness and mountains of undisclosed evidence mid-trial?" Judge Morrison considered this. "Mr. Barrett, under normal circumstances, I would agree with you. However, given that this evidence was discovered as a direct result of developments during yesterday's proceedings, I'm inclined to allow it." He raised his hand as Barrett began to protest again. "However, I will grant a 3-day continuance to give the defense time to review the new evidence and prepare accordingly." Barrett wasn't finished. "And this new witness? A child who's been through trauma is hardly a reliable witness, Your Honor." ADA Jenkins stepped forward. "Your Honor, Rafael Antunes has been examined by medical professionals and interviewed by specialists trained in trauma-informed protocols. They have determined he is able to testify. Furthermore, his testimony is corroborated by physical evidence recovered from the cabin and from the defendant's residence." From his seat, Carson stared straight ahead, his breathing shallow. The perfect defense was collapsing around him. Judge Morrison made his ruling. "I'll allow the new witness, but his testimony will be taken via closed circuit, similar to our arrangements for Lucas Mendez." He addressed the entire court. "This trial will reconvene on Monday morning. Court is adjourned." As the gallery began to clear, Elena Mendez approached Detective Novak, Lucas holding tightly to her hand with Thor beside him. "Is it true?" she asked quietly. "You found another boy?" Novak nodded, his expression softening as he looked at Lucas. "Yes, and he's going to be okay, thanks to your son and Thor." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "Will Lucas need to testify again?" "I don't think so," Novak replied. "The evidence we found at the cabin is substantial, and Raphael has begun to talk about what happened." As they spoke, Barrett cornered ADA Jenkins near the prosecution table. "What exactly did you find at that cabin?" he demanded, keeping his voice low. Jenkins met his gaze unflinchingly. "Evidence that your client has been doing this for years, Will." The SD card from the surveillance camera had dated footage of multiple children, including Lucas from the day at the park. Carson's fingerprints are all over the basement room, and the search of his home uncovered hard drives with more evidence. She paused, then added, "You might want to consider discussing plea options." Barrett's professional facade cracked slightly. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. Across the courtroom, as Carson was being led back to holding, his eyes met Thor's. The dog's posture stiffened immediately, a low growl emanating from his throat. It was no longer just the reaction of a service animal. It was the recognition of a K-9 officer who had encountered this predator before. For the first time since his arrest, real fear showed in Daniel Carson's eyes. Monday morning arrived with a sheet of iron-gray clouds hanging low over Chicago. The courthouse steps were crowded with news vans and reporters, all clamoring for details about the dramatic developments in the Carson case. Inside, the courtroom was filled to capacity, the gallery packed with journalists, law enforcement officials, and members of the public drawn by the sensational turn of events. Daniel Carson sat at the defense table, his previously impeccable appearance now showing signs of strain. His suit hung slightly loose on his frame after 3 days in county lockup, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. Beside him, William Barrett reviewed documents with the desperate focus of a man searching for any possible strategy to salvage a rapidly deteriorating case. "The plea deal is still on the table," Barrett murmured. 25 to life with possibility of parole. The alternative is multiple life sentences with no possibility of parole. Carson didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the courtroom door. Judge Morrison entered, and the proceedings began with the clinical efficiency of the American justice system. The amended charges were read into the record, and Carson entered his plea, not guilty on all counts, his voice hollow. "The prosecution may call its next witness," Judge Morrison announced. ADA Jenkins stood. "The state calls Raphael Antunes to testify, Your Honor." The courtroom quieted as the video feed activated, showing an 8-year-old boy seated in a comfortable room alongside a child advocate. Raphael looked small in the oversized chair, but his eyes were clear and determined. "Raphael," Jenkins began gently after he had been sworn in. "Can you tell us about the man who took you from the playground in Milwaukee?" Raphael's voice was soft but steady. "He said he was looking for his dog. He showed me a picture and asked if I could help him look. Then he grabbed me and put me in his car. Would you recognize this man if you saw him again?" Raphael nodded solemnly. "Yes, it's him." He pointed at the screen showing Carson in the courtroom. Barrett cross-examined with careful restraint, aware that aggressive questioning of a child victim would alienate the jury. He focused instead on timeline inconsistencies and potential coaching by investigators, a strategy that gained little traction against Raphael's straightforward account. As the testimony concluded, ADA Jenkins called her next witness. The state calls Detective Garrett Novak. Novak took the stand and methodically laid out the evidence discovered at the cabin. Carson's fingerprints on the restraints used to bind Raphael, soil matching Carson's tire treads, surveillance equipment linked to Carson's IP address, and most damning, digital evidence recovered from hidden drives in Carson's home. The defendant maintained meticulous records, Novak testified, his experienced voice giving weight to each word. Files were organized by date and location, including the attempted abduction of Lucas Mendez. Throughout Novak's testimony, Carson remained outwardly composed, though Barrett could feel him growing increasingly tense beside him. "The prosecution would like to introduce Exhibit 42, Jenkins announced. Video footage recovered from the defendant's cloud storage showing surveillance of Brighton Park on the day Lucas Mendez was targeted. As the video played, showing Carson clearly monitoring children from his parked car, a subtle shift occurred in the courtroom atmosphere. The perfect defense, based on reasonable doubt and the lack of a verbal witness, had crumbled under the weight of irrefutable evidence. Judge Morrison called for the afternoon recess. As the courtroom began to clear, an unexpected development unfolded. Lucas and Thor had been seated in the rear of the courtroom with Elena, and as Carson passed by on his way out, Lucas made the same subtle hand signal as before. Thor's reaction was immediate and pronounced. The dog lunged to the end of his leash, placing himself protectively in front of Lucas while emitting a deep, threatening growl directed at Carson. Court officers moved quickly to secure the situation, but the damage was done. For the first time, Carson's composure shattered completely. He stumbled backward, his face ashen, eyes wide with recognition. "That dog," he whispered, audible in the sudden silence. "That's the K-9 from the cabin raid last year." Detective Novak, who had been watching from nearby, stepped forward. "Yes, Mr. Carson. Thor was part of the team that almost caught you 18 months ago. He never forgot you, or what you did." The revelation sent a ripple through the courtroom. Thor's reaction wasn't just the protective instinct of a service animal. It was the trained response of a police dog who had encountered this predator before. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted palpably. Barrett leaned close to Carson, speaking urgently. "They've got you, Daniel. The jury will convict on every count. Take the deal." But it was too late for deals. As ADA Jenkins prepared to call her next witness, Carson suddenly rose to his feet. "I want to change my plea," he announced, his voice hollow. Judge Morrison's eyebrows rose. "Mr. Carson, have you discussed this with your attorney?" "Yes," Carson lied, ignoring Barrett's attempts to silence him. "I plead guilty. To all of it." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs as Barrett tried desperately to regain control of the situation. "Your Honor, I request a brief recess to confer with my client. No more delays," Carson interrupted, his facade finally crumbling completely. "That dog knows. They all know." His voice dropped to an almost inaudible level. "I'm tired of running." In that moment, the perfect defense collapsed entirely, replaced by the broken confession of a man who had finally been cornered by justice, and by the unforgettable memory of a Belgian Malinois who had never forgotten his face. The following week, courtroom 306 of the Cook County Courthouse was filled to capacity as Judge Richard Morrison prepared to deliver the sentence in the case that had captivated Chicago and drawn national attention. Journalists occupied every available seat in the press section, their pens poised and digital recorders running. The public gallery was equally crowded, filled with law enforcement personnel, victims' advocates, and citizens drawn by the extraordinary case. Daniel Carson sat at the defense table, diminished in his orange jumpsuit, the confident software engineer now replaced by a convicted predator awaiting his fate. William Barrett sat beside him, his role now limited to arguing for whatever leniency might be possible. A nearly impossible task given the circumstances of the case and Carson's dramatic courtroom confession. At the prosecution table, ADA Sarah Jenkins arranged her notes methodically, her face composed, but her eyes reflecting the weight of what they had all witnessed throughout the trial. Behind her, Detective Novak sat with his hands clasped, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts as he watched Carson. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Morrison entered the courtroom. The judge took his seat, his silver hair catching the fluorescent light, his expression grave as he surveyed the crowded room. "Be seated," he instructed, opening the file before him. "This court is now in session for the sentencing of Daniel James Carson, who has pleaded guilty to kidnapping in the first degree, false imprisonment, child endangerment, attempted kidnapping, and possession of child exploitation material." His voice was measured, each word clear and distinct in the hushed courtroom. Elena Mendez sat in the front row of the gallery, Lucas beside her with Thor at his feet. Marco Mendez had his arm protectively around his wife's shoulders. Beside them sat Rafael Antoniz's parents, their faces showing the complex mix of relief and ongoing trauma that would mark their lives for years to come. "Before I pronounce sentence, does the defendant wish to make a statement?" Judge Morrison asked, following protocol despite the gravity of the crimes. Carson rose slowly, his shoulders hunched. "No, Your Honor," he said, his voice barely audible. "Very well. Does the prosecution wish to address the court regarding sentencing? ADA Jenkins stood. Yes, Your Honor. The state recommends the maximum sentence allowable under law. Mr. Carson's methodical predation of children shows a level of calculation and moral depravity that demands the fullest measure of justice. Moreover, forensic analysis of evidence recovered from his residence indicates there may be additional victims we have not yet identified. She paused, her voice steady but charged with emotion. These children and their families deserve to know that Daniel Carson will never again have the opportunity to harm another child. Judge Morrison nodded, then turned to Barrett. Does the defense wish to address the court? Barrett rose, the strain of defending such a client evident in his face. Your Honor, while the defense acknowledges the gravity of the crimes to which Mr. Carson has pleaded guilty, we ask the court to consider that his eventual confession spared the victims the trauma of a prolonged trial. We ask for concurrent rather than consecutive sentences. The argument sounded hollow even to Barrett's own ears, a perfunctory request made without conviction. Judge Morrison didn't acknowledge the defense's request directly. Instead, he turned his attention to the impact statements that had been submitted to the court. The court has received victim impact statements from the families of Lucas Mendez and Rafael Antunes, he noted. Their words describe the profound and lasting damage Mr. Carson's actions have inflicted, not just physical harm, but deep psychological wounds that these children and their families will spend years healing from, if they ever fully recover. The judge looked directly at Carson now, his gaze unflinching. Mr. Carson, you used your intelligence and privileged position in society to prey upon its most vulnerable members. You calculated that children like Lucas and Raphael would be easy targets, that their youth would make them less credible witnesses, and that your careful planning would shield you from consequences. A heavy silence hung over the courtroom as Judge Morrison continued. What you failed to calculate was the courage of these children, the dedication of law enforcement, and the unwavering memory of a service animal who brought your crimes to light. He gestured toward Thor, who sat alert beside Lucas. Sometimes justice finds its way through unexpected channels. Judge Morrison straightened the papers before him. Daniel James Carson, having considered the heinous nature of your crimes, their premeditated character, and the devastating impact on your victims, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for each count of kidnapping, to be served consecutively, with additional concurrent sentences for the remaining charges. The finality of the sentence sent a ripple through the courtroom. Carson seemed to physically shrink, the full weight of his future descending upon him. You will be remanded immediately to the Illinois Department of Corrections to begin serving your sentence, Judge Morrison concluded. Court is adjourned. As the gavel fell, marking the official end of the case, Elena Mendez closed her eyes briefly, tears streaming down her face. Marco held her tightly, his own eyes wet. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered around the steps as Detective Novak and ADA Jenkins addressed the press. Justice was served today, Jenkins stated, her professional demeanor intact despite her obvious fatigue. But we recognize that for the victims and their families, the healing process is only beginning. A reporter called out from the crowd, Detective Novak, is it true that the service dog was key to breaking the case? Novak nodded, his usual reserve softening slightly. Thor recognized the defendant from a previous police operation. Sometimes the smallest details, or in this case, the bond between a child and a dog, can make all the difference in bringing a predator to justice. As the media continued their coverage, the true impact of the case was being felt not in front of cameras, but in the quiet moments of families beginning to rebuild their lives from the wreckage of trauma, and in the silent connection between a boy and the dog who had helped him find his voice again. 3 weeks after the sentencing, spring had begun to soften Chicago's harsh winter edges. In a sunlit room at the Midwest Children's Trauma Recovery Center, Lucas Mendez sat cross-legged on a colorful rug, Thor resting beside him with his head on the boy's knee. Dr. Elise Winters observed from a comfortable distance, her notepad balanced on her lap, recording the subtle but significant changes in her young patient. "How are we feeling today, Lucas?" she asked gently, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who had dedicated her career to helping traumatized children find their way back to themselves. Lucas stroked Thor's fur methodically, finding comfort in the repetitive motion. Since Carson's sentencing, tiny fragments of his voice had begun to emerge, single words at first, whispered so softly they could barely be heard. Progress measured in syllables rather than sentences, but progress nonetheless. "Okay," he whispered, the word hanging delicately in the air between them. Dr. Winters smiled, careful not to make too much of this small victory. "That's good to hear. And how about Thor? How's he doing today?" Lucas looked down at the Belgian Malinois, whose amber eyes gazed up at him with unwavering devotion. "Happy," he said, a little louder this time. "Thor is happy." Outside in the waiting area, Elena and Marco Mendez sat together, her head resting on his shoulder as they waited for the session to conclude. The past months had tested their marriage, their faith, their resilience, but they had weathered the storm together. "He spoke to me this morning," Elena said softly. "Real sentences. He asked if we could take Thor to the park this weekend." Marco's breath caught slightly. "The park? Is he ready for that?" Dr. Winters thinks it might be good, a controlled outing to reclaim what was taken from him, to show him that not all parks hold danger. She interlaced her fingers with her husband's. "We'll all go together. As a family." Back in the therapy room, Dr. Winters had moved to sit on the floor near Lucas, respecting his space while gradually decreasing the distance between them, a physical representation of the emotional barriers slowly being dismantled. "I have something I'd like to share with you, Lucas," she said, opening a folder. "Remember Raphael, the other boy you helped? He sent you a drawing." She placed a colorful crayon picture on the floor between them. It showed two stick figures, one smaller, one larger, standing beside what was clearly meant to be Thor. Above them, written in the uneven letters of a child still mastering writing, were the words, "Thank you, Lucas and Thor." Lucas stared at the drawing, something shifting in his expression. He reached out to touch the paper, tracing the outline of the dog figure with one finger. "Thor saved him," he said suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "Like he saved me." Dr. Winters nodded, allowing Lucas to process this moment without pushing. "Yes, he did. And do you know what Raphael told me when I saw him last week? He said he wants to be a police officer when he grows up, so he can help other kids like you helped him." A slight smile, the first Dr. Winters had seen, touched Lucas's lips. That evening, Detective Novak visited the Mendez home, something he had done weekly since the trial concluded. These visits had begun as professional follow-up, but had evolved into something more personal, the detective feeling a connection to this family that went beyond his official duties. "He's speaking more," Elena told him as they sat in the living room, watching through the patio doors as Marco played a gentle game of fetch with Lucas and Thor in the backyard. "Full sentences sometimes." Novak nodded, the lines around his eyes crinkling in a rare smile. "That's tremendous progress. The resilience of children never ceases to amaze me, even after all these years." Elena studied the detective's weathered face. "This case changed you too, didn't it?" He considered this, watching as Lucas laughed, actually laughed, when Thor playfully shook a toy. "I've worked hundreds of cases over my career, Mrs. Mendez. Too many involving children. You learn to build walls, to compartmentalize. But sometimes, a case breaks through those walls." He paused. "Seeing your son's journey from silence to speaking again, it reminds me why I do this work." Outside, as twilight began to settle over the yard, Lucas sat on the grass with Thor beside him. The dog's scar, which once seemed so stark against his fur, had begun to fade slightly with time, much like the invisible scars Lucas carried. "Dad," Lucas called, his voice clear in the evening air. "Can Thor sleep in my room tonight?" Marco looked over at his son, momentarily struck speechless by the normalcy of the request after so many months of silence. "Of course, Mijo. Of course he can." Later that night, after Lucas had been tucked into bed with Thor curled protectively at his feet, Elena stood in the doorway watching her son sleep peacefully for the first time in months. "He's coming back to us," Marco whispered, standing behind her with his arms wrapped around her waist. "He never left," Elena replied softly. "He was just finding his way through the darkness." In the dim glow of the nightlight, Lucas stirred slightly, reaching down to rest his hand on Thor's back. The dog shifted closer, his solid presence a tangible reminder of safety. "Thank you," Lucas whispered into the quiet room, the words meant only for the ears of his faithful companion. Thor's tail thumped gently against the bed in response. No translation needed for the language that existed between a boy and the dog who had helped him find his voice again. Some bonds, formed in the crucible of shared trauma and healing, become unbreakable. And in that unbreakable bond, both had found something profound. Lucas had found his courage, and Thor had found his forever home. As moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the peaceful scene, the final chapter of their shared story was not one of trauma, but of triumph, not of silence, but of healing. And in homes across the city, other children slept safer tonight because of what they had accomplished together. Subscribe now, hit that like button, turn on notifications, and if you've watched this far, comment, "I watched till the end," and share your thoughts on this story. Oh, and don't forget to check out the next video that appears in the end screen. It's going to be incredibly moving.